This video explains the egregious past wrong done to Punjabis and Sikhs in India by Pakistani and Indian leaders under German influence concerning the Indus Waters Treaty, which we should undo without going to war over it. Hello friends, this is Unmasked Truth with Harmanjit Saini, where I provide unique analysis of world events based on the unmasked truth that after surrender, Germany continued World War II clandestinely and became a killing machine. I also provide true news that you will find nowhere else. This is a call to Greater Punjab leaders, including Sikh leaders, to recognize the tremendous harm Pakistani and Indian leaders have done to us under the evil influence of Germans, which we need to undo so that we do not continue to suffer in the future. By Greater Punjab and Punjabis, I mean people living in the Punjab, Haryana, Jammu and Kashmir, Himachal Pradesh, Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, and Uttarakhand states of India. The great harm done to us over the past 62 years has been the Indus Waters Treaty signed in Karachi, Pakistan on 19 September 1960 by Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and Pakistani President General Ayub Khan, brokered by the World Bank. The treaty allocates the waters of the three eastern rivers, the Satluj, Beas, and Ravi, for exclusive use in India, and the waters of the three western rivers, the Indus, Jhelum, and Chenab, to Pakistan, with India being able to utilize small portions for irrigation, drinking, storage to control flooding, and other non-consumption uses such as generating electricity. Effectively, 80% of the water of the Indus basin under the treaty went to Pakistan for consumption, whereas only 20% was allocated to India. Of the amount of the water allocated to India, it utilizes only about 80%. The remaining water flows free to Pakistan. So effectively, for the past 62 years, India's share of the waters of the six rivers has been 16%, whereas Pakistan has been consuming 80% of the waters. If ever there was a grossly inequitable treaty, this was one. Pakistan is expert at using propaganda to distort reality and exert pressure on its opponents, particularly India. Whenever India tries to use the waters within the terms of the treaty in new irrigation schemes or hydroelectric power projects, it spreads misinformation that India is trying to take away Pakistan's water. Pakistani public has been incorrectly led to believe that India is constructing many dams to stop the flow of water to Pakistan in contravention of the Indus Waters Treaty. It incites terror outfits based in Pakistan such as Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed to threaten India with terrorism if India tries to take away Pakistan's water. It has even threatened to use the nuclear option if India tried to stop the flow of water to Pakistan, which India has never tried to do since signing the treaty. Pakistan objects each and every time India tries to implement a project to use the waters of the western rivers as allowed per the terms of the treaty, and invokes the dispute resolution mechanism as a tactic to delay the start and implementation of the projects. It raises costs of the projects for India while the water allocated to India continues to flow free to Pakistan. Now, according to retired Major General Ajay Kumar Chaturvedi, India needs to harness the hydroelectric potentials of the western rivers as entitled to her within the provisions of the Indus Waters Treaty to ensure that the power requirements of the state of Jammu and Kashmir are fully met. Currently, out of a potential of 18,653 megawatts, only 2,324 megawatts is being exploited, and therefore it would be in fitness of things that India creates the necessary infrastructure to store the water to the extent of her entitlements and generates hydroelectricity as provided in the treaty. India has planned 21 projects on Chenab River, 13 projects on the Jhelum River, and Upper Sindh Phase 2 Project 36. Most of these are hydroelectric projects, and by no stretch of the imagination, these are meant to store water more than what is permissible. Pakistan questions 27 of India's legitimate projects on western rivers. In fact, whenever Pakistan has gone to arbitration, neutral experts or the International Court of Justice, every time India's right to use waters of the western rivers for the purposes stipulated in the Indus Waters Treaty has been upheld. Latest cases in point are decisions on Baglir and Kishan Ganga hydroelectric projects. Once again, Pakistan is expressing concerns about the designs of 5 Indian projects, namely Pakal Ratle, Kishan Ganga, Lower Kalnai, all in Jammu and Kashmir, and Meyar Nala in Himachal Pradesh. These are all in various stages of construction despite Pakistan's objections. It may be noted that Kishan Ganga hydroelectric project has already got completed but is still being questioned by Pakistan. Pakistan's relentless objections and propaganda on the issue can be gauged from its objections to Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's recent visit to Kashmir on April 24, 2022, to lay the foundation stones for the construction of the Ratle and Kwar hydroelectric power projects on the Chenab River. Pakistan's Foreign Office said in a statement, Pakistan calls upon India to fulfill its obligations under the treaty and refrain from taking any such steps which are detrimental to the treaty framework. Pakistan's tactics have been to keep objecting to projects allowed to India even under the lopsided treaty in favor of Pakistan. That would put pressure on India to never even think of renegotiating the treaty. An important question to ask is why has India delayed taking even its allotted share of the water for so long? The treaty was signed in 1960. Now, 62 years later, we are laying the foundation stones of projects to raise the harnessing of the hydroelectric power potential allowed under the treaty from the current approximately 12% to a mere 20%. Why more projects were not completed decades earlier, as well as more waters of the rivers utilized as permitted under the treaty? The reasons are the same that caused this lopsided treaty to be signed in the first place. The reason is that such terribly unfair and unjust treaties are not signed because one side is brilliant at negotiating and the other side can be easily fooled. Such treaties come into existence because the losing party was not involved in the negotiations, and the parties negotiating were colluding to deliberately harm and, if possible, destroy the affected losing party. The negotiating parties were India and Pakistan, facilitated by the World Bank. The affected parties were Pakistan and the Indian states of Punjab, Haryana, Himachal Pradesh, with the three states being the undivided Punjab state before 1966, in which year they were divided into the three states, and then Jammu and Kashmir, Rajasthan, and the Union Territory of Chandigarh. No leader representative of these affected states were involved in the negotiations. This is how the egregiously one-side treaty came into force. After India's partition into India and Pakistan, the question of using the waters of the six rivers immediately arose because the rivers first passed through the territory controlled by India and then into Pakistan. Pakistan feared that India could control the waters of the rivers that flow into Pakistan to cause floods and droughts. During the initial discussion, neither side was willing to compromise, with Pakistan insisting that it had a right to waters of all the Indus tributaries that historically flow to Pakistan, whereas India argued that historical flows should not set future allocation. The Pakistan position meant that if India needed more water for development and agriculture, it could not increase its use of the water from the rivers. World Bank was interested in economic development in the region and got involved in the discussions in 1951. When 2 years of discussions produced no results, the World Bank offered its own proposals in 1954, allocating the eastern rivers to India and the western rivers to Pakistan without taking into account the historical usage by Pakistan. The negotiations dragged on for 6 more years. The last sticking point was the financing of the canals and storage facilities to divert the waters of the western rivers to Pakistan. In the final settlement, India agreed to give 62 million pounds worth of gold in 10 annual installments to Pakistan, with each grant being provided with other grants being provided by the United States, Germany, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. In 2003, Jammu and Kashmir state, a majority Muslim state in India, passed a resolution for abrogation of the treaty, and in 2016 it asked for revision of the treaty because the state and its people are treated as a non-entity in the treaty. So why did India's Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru agree to sign a treaty so lopsided in favor of Pakistan in 1960 with Pakistan President Ayub Khan? For the answer, we have to look at who was in charge of the government in the United States. From 1945 to 1960, two German masqueraders, Harry S. Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower, were presidents of the United States and working with the Nazis in Germany, who had continued World War II clandestinely a mere 2 years after the war ended. The Germans were engaged in punishing all peoples who had fought against them in the war. Sikhs of Punjab state in India, who had served in the British Indian Army in large numbers, were their prime target in India. Yes, the US government, led by the masqueraders who appointed heads of the World Bank, were engaged in punishing the Sikhs in Punjab state in India in collusion with the Germans. Then the British, led by the German masquerader Lord Mountbatten as Viceroy of India, had sown the seed in the mind of Nehru and other leaders to beware of Sikhs because of their representation in the Indian armed forces and to an even greater extent in the leadership in the army. Nehru and the leadership were led to believe that the Sikhs could militarily take over government in India, which Sikhs had no intention of doing as indicated in their history. Thereafter, Nehru and most of the Indian leadership was engaged in suppressing the Sikhs as much as possible and impoverishing them. The Germans had also made alliances with top Indian business leaders led by the Marwadis, Birlas, Dalmias, Tatas, and others who were engaged in discriminating against the Sikhs in employment and in every other way possible. The Germans had also made alliances with Pakistanis, particularly Pashtuns, to continue to find pretexts to wage war against India, where the Sikhs and Punjabis would have to bear the brunt of the war, being the border state between India and Pakistan. They also taught their methods of negotiating with no compromise to extract the maximum from the opponent and using threats of war to intimidate and pressure the opponent. That's how President of Pakistan, General Ayub Khan, a Pashtun, negotiated with India concerning the Indus Waters Treaty and pressured India with threats of war if India ever tried to stop the flow of water, knowing well that India had no intention of doing so after the initial incident in 1948. After the treaty was signed, Pakistan has continued to use the same tactic of threat of war, false propaganda to inflame Pakistan public opinion against India, accusing it of trying to stop water from flowing to Pakistan or using Pakistan's water under the treaty, and objecting to every project India wants to undertake within the bounds of the treaty to delay it so that the water that India is entitled to keeps flowing to Pakistan. While Nehru was not personally allied with the Germans, he could be easily persuaded to make decisions that would keep the Sikhs suppressed. Despite all the suppression and discrimination, Punjab and the Sikhs had the highest per capita GDP in the country. Since the treaty would harm the Sikhs and Punjabis the most, Nehru was easily persuaded by Indian businessmen and other leaders to sign the lopsided treaty favoring Pakistan. Nehru went even further. He agreed to pay 125 metric tons of gold worth 62 million 60,000 British pounds sterling in 10 equal installments to Pakistan to finance the building of canals and storage facilities to divert the waters of the western rivers for its use. The rest of the financing came from various governments, with the second largest grant coming from Germany. In 1960, Germany was relatively not that rich a country, but it was willing to finance the treaty because they knew it would hurt the Sikhs and Punjabis in India. So was the US government, led by masqueraders willing to provide finance to make the deal possible. Another reason was that with the completion of these projects, Germany was trying to make Pakistan secure from threats of stoppage of water of the western rivers because Ayub Khan was being prepared to attack India in 1965 over Kashmir to punish the Sikhs. Many Indians were colluding with the Germans to facilitate the war with the aim of allowing Pakistani army to walk in all the way to the Indian capital Delhi by ordering the Indian army to withdraw for better defense. The Pakistani army would then commit genocide on the Sikhs and Punjabis. Perhaps we can now understand why even after 62 years of signing the treaty, Indian government keeps delaying projects to utilize the waters of the rivers it's entitled to. The Nehrus and Gandhis, which means Prime Ministers Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi, being daughter and grandson of Nehru respectively, have headed Indian government much of the time after the treaty was signed. After that, all other governments, mostly the Bharatiya Janata Party of the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, have been allied with Germany and take their orders from them. They only pay lip service when they talk about the evil treaty, unfair treaty, but delay doing anything about it because Germany and German masqueraders in the United States and Britain would scold them. That's why little progress is being made towards utilizing the waters of the rivers under the treaty. So, no wonder this lopsided treaty has been considered one of the most successful water sharing arrangements in the world today because since its ratification in 1960, India and Pakistan have not gone to war over water sharing, though they have engaged in several military conflicts. Most disagreements and disputes have been settled via legal procedures under the dispute resolution mechanisms within the framework of the treaty. The reasons are obvious. Those in India who can object do not do so because they are allied with the Germans and German masqueraders and are pursuing the common goal of suppressing the Sikhs and Punjabis with the ultimate goal of destroying them. So, what action can Punjabis, that is, people living in the Indian states of Punjab, Haryana, Himachal Pradesh, Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, and Uttarakhand, and Kashmiris take? As far as they are concerned, the treaty affects them the most. But they were never part of the negotiations, hence, they have every right to abrogate the treaty. Majority Muslims know they are being heavily adversely affected by the provisions of the treaty. This is the majority Muslims in Kashmir. That is why the state voted to abrogate the treaty in 2003 and for revision to it in 2016. Negotiations on the Indian side as well as the Pakistani side were carried out with malafide intentions of harming the Sikhs and Punjabis to impoverish them. When an agreement is reached designed to harm the most affected party, which was not itself party to the negotiations, it cannot be bound by the terms of the treaty. Hence, the Punjabis and Kashmiris have every right to abrogate the treaty. Here is my advice to the leadership of the states of Punjab, Haryana, Himachal Pradesh, Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and Jammu and Kashmir. You need to join together and stand up for your rights. Pressure Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his government to completely renegotiate the treaty with Pakistan. Your representatives must take the lead in the negotiations and not representatives from India's other states. Narendra Modi will try delay tactics as the Germans will order him to do so, but pressure him to renegotiate the treaty by threatening to withdraw support from his government. Pakistan will use its usual tactics of threatening war and terrorism to refuse to renegotiate the treaty. Call their bluff. Tell them that that we can handle their threats and the treaty must be renegotiated. If they refuse to negotiate, then immediately begin financing and implementation of projects to use the waters allocated under the treaty already. Once that task is completed, then use the threat of using additional water for our own use, which we think is fair. That will force Pakistan to renegotiate. So here is my advice to Pakistan. We are not interested in destroying Pakistan by stopping the flow of water to Pakistan. We don't want to go to war over it. But as the treaty stands, it is grossly unfair and was originally negotiated by men with malafide intentions towards Punjabis, Sikhs, and Kashmiris in India. We cannot let that stand. We want you to survive as we want to survive also. Our situation is dire and we need more water for our use and want only a fair share of it. Water is a scarce resource. We and you have to use it wisely and efficiently. Let's approach the problem this way and renegotiate the treaty to reach an equitable settlement. Please refrain from intimidating us with threats of war and terrorism. We are willing to call your bluff. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please continue to watch my videos and read my articles on important world events, World War III watch, politics, international business, advice on health and medical problems, and much more for in-depth and insightful analysis. Please also subscribe to my YouTube and Facebook channels, Unmasked Truth with Harmanjit Saini, to view and get information on the latest videos. Some people do not have the time to go through the full length of videos. They find it more convenient to read the text of the video. Unfortunately, YouTube does not provide the facility to make the text of my videos available on YouTube. But fortunately, Facebook does provide that facility. So I make the text of my videos available on my Facebook channel, which you can easily copy.